Alex is an artist from London who has been working in Berlin for the last 5 years. He's just completed his master's at Spatial Strategies in Weissensee School of Art. He's the co-director of Wasteland Twinning Network, a transdisciplinary network for parallel research into urban wastelands. His work often involves people, discussion, and bringing large bodies of research into public light, either through events, radio, or publications like the one in front of us today. He's created a number of radio essays, provocative forerunners of this book, covering research and reflections on wastelands and artistic production. A recent one, titled Burnout, was a critique of modern labor, mixed with collaborative creative work and a staged radio play of a stock exchange crash. In true Orwellian fashion, this caused the New York Stock Exchange to crash the very next day. As many of us know, Alex is not hesitant to be provocateur, thus the very fitting title of his book, Here Comes Trouble. We know that Alex will be making some trouble, so I'll let him get to that shortly. I want to talk about why the trouble is important. Donna Haraway, well known for her cyborg manifesto, has taken to the saying of staying with the trouble. And in a recent lecture of her, she explains that it matters what stories tell stories. I'm quoting her. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds. We need to take seriously the acquisition of that kind of skill, emotional, intellectual, material skill to destabilize our own stories, to retell them with other stories, and vice versa. A kind of serious denormalization of that which is normally held still in order to do that which one thinks one is doing. It matters to destabilize worlds of thinking with other worlds of thinking. And I think Alex's book sticks to this trouble. In fact, it's a feat of curiosity and determination how he intersects many worlds, thoughts, and stories in an attempt to knock us out of our habitual orbits and create new constellations of systems and ideas. I somewhat cheekily claim the title of editor in the book, and have had the intense pleasure of watching, questioning, and discussing the book as it's developed. It's led to some fantastic journeys to see witch burning memorials, to follow intercalary elements down to the end of their research trails, and to catch geologists off guard with questions about rock formation and fractional crystallization from an artist's point of view. What is revealed in this book, and what I'm sure we'll see now in his presentation, is a fearless and admirable engagement to theory, history, science, and very importantly, to the people of and in our lives.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I guess I have to follow the formalities and thank the institution at the beginning of the talk. So thank you very much to ZKU, which has been from the very inception a place that has rejected the idea of becoming as a final entity, and which is a space which is in constant evolution and constant development, which of course presents certain problems along the way, but also allows spaces for new ideas to evolve and for new peoples to come together. So thank you to ZKU, and thank you, of course, to Michael Braithwaite for your wonderful music so far today. Thank you also to NTS Radio London and to Kunchi Radio in Yogyakarta. I have to also thank Philip Koller for his amazing work with the layout of Here Comes Trouble, and again to thank Anna for her wonderful work as editor and supporter throughout this project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through different scales of argumentation, and basically, without becoming overly complicated, I think you can meaningfully jump between different scales of argumentation, from molecular scales through to social and market ones, and then to kind of broader historical arguments as a way of looking at deviancy, what deviancy might be, how deviancy might perform, and how historically those who have been deemed socially deviant have been treated and often persecuted, as it were, for falling out of the kind of normal accepted standards for a society at a given point in history. So I'm going to start off with the very smallest scale that one can imagine, the very smallest scale that's measurable, which is the kind of molecular scale, and kind of build the argument through different sort of examples up until the end, where hopefully we can have some sort of discussion afterwards about what deviancy might mean today, whether or not kind of some of the case studies into madness and the persecution of women as witches are maybe starting to show their heads again, or maybe we're not there yet. So when I first started looking at this idea of deviancy, it became clear that there isn't a kind of a sort of final definition for it. I mean, by very definition, deviancy itself is something which is sort of on the move. It's something which doesn't quite fit into what we understand. It doesn't really present itself in a clear, straightforward fashion. And you can sort of understand that if you look at the way in which this thermodynamic system, which I've got modeled for you in the projection, is kind of representing the transition of molecules from one state to another. So on the left, you have water, and the molecules are, they're not totally bunched together, but they're sort of fairly loose, but they're still more closely oriented with one another. And then on the right, you have gas, so kind of a water vapor evaporation. So this is basically a thermodynamic system of water boiling. And what you find is that there's always this kind of transitional area, this kind of morphological arena in the middle, where the molecules aren't really water and they aren't really gas, and so the behavior they're exhibiting there is kind of deviant in the sense that they're not really the water and they're not really the gas, but they're occupying this weird kind of behavior. And that behavior for water molecules, as they go through this sort of boiling process, is to move faster. So if you look at gas, the molecules within gas are kind of whizzing around all over the place, they're chaotically organized, and as you get kind of cooler and closer towards the ice state of water, they become more rigidly bound together. And this is important for me because what I'm trying to say is that this deviant zone here, it's not like a third space, it's not a third category. It actually defies both of the other categories of water and gas. So it's occupying a sort of slightly strange state. Now, the way in which I got into thinking on this scale and thinking in this kind of processual way was reading a book called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History by Manuel de Landa. And what he does is he systematizes history, really, through all kinds of different material interactions. So he sort of says, it's not enough to look at the historical record and say that, we're moving in this nice linear progression where we invent technology improves our lives, and then we sort of ratchet up the kind of evolutionary hierarchy. He's saying that actually these processes, they're kind of cyclical, they're non-linear, they feed back on each other. We might make some progress in one way, but then something is lost or the material runs out, in a very basic example, and then we go back to other forms of inhabitation, other forms of dealing with each other, other forms of trading, and then the kind of, the social consequences of those different processes start to enact themselves. And you can start to look at history as actually a series of kind of energy transfers, as a series of material kind of interactions, which then have subsequent social consequences. And the thing I think that kind of convinced me of the value of being able to argue like this, of it kind of being a meaningful way of looking at history, was a very simple example that he gives of a scientist named Ilya Prigogine. And what he said is he made this kind of wonderful comparison between this thermodynamic level, this thermodynamic scale, and a kind of anthropological one. So Iberol says that, well, you could make an analogy between the movement of gas particles, these kind of widely dispersed, chaotic, sort of quickly moving entities, and kind of hunter-gatherers. So hunter-gatherers, historically speaking, are kind of not really bound by a particular place. They weren't bound by a particular source of energy. They were moving around, they were hunting and gathering, of course. He goes on to say that, well, if you look at the early agricultural society, then you start to have kind of a closer relation between people, a sort of more densely bunched group of inhabitants and sort of social practices that come with that, well, maybe that's a bit like water. Maybe that's this kind of bound but not entirely fixed behavior, which we're starting to see there. And then he makes, which I think is a nice kind of analogy for the urban sphere, the analogy with ice. So, in the kind of ice state of water, the molecules are really bunched together. They're really kind of like about one another. They're really having a lot of kind of, they're very close spatially. So that kind of simple argumentation for me meant that I was able to kind of jump into the world of physics, something which I don't have any kind of background in actually, and start to try and pick up the pieces and do the research into like, well, what is sort of this thermodynamic system? How does that actually work? How is it measured? What are the actual differences between these different stages? And one of the key differences in the way in which it's described is the idea of entropy. So entropy is really sort of breaking down of a system. It's really about molecules and atoms kind of falling apart from one another. And the way in which we deal with that is that we use an external energy source to kind of try and keep things together. So you can think of that on a large scale in terms of a society. We use fossil fuels, we use gas, we pump this energy into our societies, and it allows us to keep some sort of social order, some sort of sense of where the days lie and what's going to come next, and can I make some money and pay the bills and keep it all going. Of course, once you remove those, then you start to get this kind of social breakdown. And so through sort of looking at entropy, through looking at thermodynamics, I was then able to kind of move on to another analogy, which is more to do with geology. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of shift sideways into a geological argument, and then I'm going to come back to the social arguments afterwards. So one of the kind of examples that Delander gives, and he's very keen not to give a kind of totalizing theory for everything, and I would agree with that pursuit. I'm not trying to come up with a kind of a master plan, a master theory for how everything in the world and the universe operates, but I'm trying to look for a very specific moment where matter transitions from one thing to another. And I think that's where you can start to find examples of what we can call deviancy. So Delander looks at this kind of intermesh of granite. And granite is basically, it's one of the most common rock form that we find on the crust of the Earth. And it's composed of these sort of different minerals which have been sort of intermeshed together. And so what you find is that you have actually a kind of a base molecule, which is silica, which is this incredibly prevalent mineral within all rock forms. And then you get these different expressions. So on the top you have biotite, in the middle you have quartz, and at the bottom you have K-feldspar. And this is a sample which I was given very generously by the Norwegian Natural History Museum. And so what's interesting, I think, about the way that granite forms is that it goes through a process of sort of knitting itself together, of kind of becoming enmeshed. As it cools, the different minerals have different cooling rates. And basically, the way that you get this intermesh is because some of them cool before others. And therefore they create little pockets, little chambers, which allow the other minerals to kind of slip in and get this very, very dense, very, very strong rock formation. Now, when you look at granite and you start to understand its kind of chemical composition, then some of the parts in it become particularly exciting because they don't simply cool and become crystallized the way that the quartz, which is just a kind of a pure silica formation, they actually operate as catalysts for overall processes of crystallization. And what Delander calls these, and he's taking it from Deleuze and Guattari, are intercalary elements. And basically, these intercalary elements, which I've represented in yellow, they operate within the sort of chain constructions of these slow crystallizing processes. So they might be something like aluminium or calcium, magnesium, but they're kind of defects in a sense. They don't belong to the kind of pure quartz crystalline formation. And what happens, interestingly, I think, is that within the biotite, you get these intercalary elements between the sheets. So biotite forms in these kind of like sheets of molecules arranging themselves in quite nice kind of lines. And then in between those sheets, you get the kind of intercalary elements, say magnesium, and that allows them to kind of bond together and finally kind of crystallize. Now, in the bottom example of K-feldspar, which is this kind of like pinky stuff, they actually act as a kind of like internal kind of conglomerate meshwork. So actually what they're doing is they're allowing the internal process, the internal structure of the feldspar to actually kind of like mesh and solidify. And so there's this kind of like processual idea of how granite is forming. Now, what De Lande does, and what I also think is particularly kind of exciting, because it allows us to make that kind of anthropological leap that Iberol has made previously in the water diagram that I was showing you. He says, well, there are lots of processes going on within the formation of societies, within the formation of social practices, and the way in which societies draw minerals and energy from their environment to build what we now know to be sort of cities and sort of stable states and economies and all this stuff which we sort of see, but we don't necessarily question the real catalyst for, the real drive behind it, or really what allows that to take place. We sort of approach a market, for example, now as something which is a given, something which has a series of flows and checks and balances built into it. But actually what you see when you start to get into these processes, which are really a form of systems analysis, and I'll talk about systems analysis in a little while, is that actually they're contingent on so many different material processes, and really from a very small scale up to the larger scale, you can see these kind of patterns emerging. And that in itself, I think, triggers philosophical questions about, how much impetus do we really have? Are we working in a linear development through life, or are we just part of a much bigger time scale, which just then is sort of folded back into the Earth's crust? And the idea of time, I think, changes in that sense as well. So what De Lande does then is that he kind of draws upon the way in which these different catalysts are involved in geological processes, and he makes another leap. He jumps up to the market scale. And he says that basically in the study of like a medieval market, for example, which are these, they're not the earliest markets. I mean, markets have been around, as David Graeber has recently written in his book Debt. They've been really around since the beginning of the history of mankind, really. But in the medieval period, and particularly in Western Europe, you get this kind of calcification, you get this kind of regularity, and you start to get all different kinds of energy and different types of product and service which are operating around these kind of attractors. So the market forms as a way in which these different heterogeneous forms of energy and material kind of intermesh and come together. And what allows that to happen? Well, it's kind of the price mechanism. It's a kind of an agreement that's made through a series of discussions by all the different people at the market about the relative worth of one thing versus another. Well, one thing being olives or cups or necklaces or leather satchels or whatever it is, they kind of bind around the capacity to trade one thing for another, the capacity to bring those different energy formations into a sort of exchange, a kind of mutual evaluation in a sense. Now, of course, it's not binary. It would take forever if you only had a barter market and everyone came and they just wanted, like, well, I actually only want apples and I've only got grapes. You'd spend the rest of your life trying to find a match. So the price mechanism allows and facilitates an exchange of not like for like, but in a way money itself allows an abstract kind of trust that then you can do a lot more with, you can do a lot more trading with, and you can allow many more types of energy to become commensurable with one another. And so what I've tried to do is kind of model that and sort of say, well, what if I took the drawings which emerged from the study of geology and atoms and so forth, and kind of build a model which allows us to see the consequences of further and further trade, of more and more exchange, of more and more different types of material and energy becoming commensurate with one another. And that's really kind of where I got to, I think, once most of the writing was completed. I wanted to try and translate the arguments that I've been excited by back into a visual platform. So this is kind of roughly where we go, but then of course, as things develop, you get all kinds of stories and narratives which are left in the margins of history. So, you can take this like proto-material reading of history and say that, the market operates on its own, as we've been encouraged to believe since the Reagan-Thatcherite years. we don't need to regulate the market has its own logic, the market has its own kind of practice, its own way of being. Actually, what you find, of course, from Marx's point of view, when you scratch away the surface and you look at the day-to-day lives of people producing, is it's human labor which is creating the value of those objects, you know. I mean, it's very rare, I think, certainly in the medieval period, that you would get like a raw material being traded for a raw material. These things have to be worked, they have to be produced, they have to be kind of brought into some sort of exchange value, and that's what Marx would call necessary labor time. So I wanted to just use this illustration as an example that, you know, these kind of bonding elements, these kind of nice, neat and tidy schematics are actually coupled and really sort of dependent on human labor and human labor time. So again, we're going to get into like, who are these guys a little bit further down the line, because it's also, of course, has a huge consequence on people of the way a market evolves or fails. So you get these, you know, more and more complex conglomerations of exchange. You get more and more trade being made, you get vast expansions, and then you get eventually, I guess, early Renaissance, sort of like 15th century, you get the emergence of a money market of its own. So people just, you know, trading, as it were, stocks and shares, people monopolizing, people kind of interfering with, if you like, the kind of more like one-to-one interactions which are taking place in the market before. And then, of course, once that happens, and once people develop new technologies with which to withdraw more energy and more material from the natural environment, then you start to get this kind of big bang, and you start to get a huge scaling up of exchange, and with that exchange, regulatory institution. Because Delander makes the point, which I think is valid, that with each exchange, not only is it a material and energetic one, but it's also customs, laws, ways of enforcing rights of usage. And so you have, of course, the necessity to secure your market. You need to make sure that people can trade freely. You need to make sure that there's a kind of some sort of regulatory institution. Now, these all develop quite slowly, and actually what Delander has mapped as well is the way in which different like agreements of usage and different ways of trading actually travel with the materials themselves. And historically, you can find like trade agreements that start off somewhere in the south of Italy being adopted somewhere in kind of like east of Germany, because they've traveled with the actual traders themselves. And so customs develop, they become more formalized, and eventually, inevitably, you get the state. And you get like a proper kind of top-down regulatory apparatus. It gets bigger and bigger, and as it gets bigger and bigger, it has to become stronger and stronger. It needs to be more and more formalized. And what happens as something becomes more formalized? Well, as Foucault and Silvia Federici have detailed in their two works, Madness and Civilization, and Caliban and the Witch, which have been very much the kind of two central texts that I've studied within Trouble, you get the kind of culture of regulatory institution as well. So it no longer applies only to the way in which people trade and to the objects and things which people are trading, but it also becomes a way of managing, it's really a kind of master plan for managing society. Who can work? Who can't work? What can they produce for me, you know, as a governing body? You have this transition which takes place around this time from a kind of feudal relationship whereby the people working the land are producing produce, but they're basically given the land that they're working on through hereditary processes, to actually being kicked off of the land and having to work for a wage. And of course this happens slowly, and it doesn't happen without a huge amount of upheaval and rebellion. People don't take lightly, people didn't take lightly, still don't, to being thrown off of their land and being told they have to work in a factory to produce a wage to pay the rent. This is a long process that takes about, well, you could say it's still going on now in some parts of the world, but certainly this kind of particularly violent transitional zone that I'm interested in the book is really a kind of, you know, pre-Renaissance through to kind of early classical. So we're talking about the kind of 15th through to the 17th century. If you want to bracket it like that, again, it's fluid, but that's definitely the most violent period, historically speaking. And so these institutions, which I think appropriately enough are represented like by a cross, right? are really kind of an argument between an emerging regulatory characteristic for the emerging merchant class and the emerging state, and this kind of more kind of horizontal, more meshwork, more kind of disbanded series of decision-making processes which are coming into conflict with a more horizontal, hierarchical, kind of linear, top-down institutional regulation. And that's kind of why I've chosen this cross to kind of represent the way in which that transition is taking place. Okay, I put this one in because I think it's important to note that last year and the year before, Rafael Polo, who's here, and Yolanda Todt and Leah Bergenau, we all attempted to basically organize a sort of an economy without those two essential factors, right? So without the intercalary element, the price mechanism, and without the regulatory apparatus. And so what we tried to do was organize a time bank, where basically you would use your time to acquire the skills of someone else, skills that you didn't have, like language lessons or programming or what have you. And there would be a sort of a trade which would be done on trust, and you would give something of your own ability, of your own worth, back into that time bank, and then you would make an exchange. It didn't work. It was very, very complicated. It turned out that when you take away the intercalary element and when you take away the regulatory institution, you kind of get left with all the bits sort of like lying around you. It's like, oh God. But I think it was worth it because it allowed us to have a kind of empirical understanding of how these markets work and don't work. You know, what is it actually that you are capable of doing? Like, how radical can you be? How far can you push that? So this is the illustration which I sort of came up with for that. Again, we can talk about all these things afterwards in more detail, if you like. So what I was then faced with was, you know, a problem of scale, a problem of historicization, and a way in which to try and make those arguments around, you know, something which is sort of changing the world around you, something which is actually a kind of material external factor, but is nonetheless changing the lives of subjects, of people, of subjectivities, of the way in which people understand one another, essentially of the culture of a society. And so, you know, you face a problem as a kind of sociologist in that moment of kind of representation. And so what I've had to do, and which I think is a valuable thing to do, but is also open to questioning, is I've created typologies to some extent. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of run you through my different typologies, and then I'm going to try and explain how I think those material processes relate to the problem of deviancy and what was going on in that time with regard to women being burned as witches and the mentally disabled. So this is my first typology, whom you've already met, who is like a kind of rebellious agricultural worker. We have the social deviant, who is deemed more and more to be the type of person who is either unwilling or unable to fit into these new manufacturing processes. You know, like as people get kind of thrown off the land and they get kind of forced into new forms of productivity, as I mentioned, there's a lot of kind of friction there. And there's also actually not that many ways to make a living at that point. You know, you don't have the kind of early industrial revolution. You don't have the kind of systems of labor that we have now, and arguably are going back into time without labor, without work. So you have these kind of social deviants who are previously, Foucault would go on to write his seminal work, Madness and Civilization, and document the process by which the mentally disabled in the medieval period were regarded as like enlightened. You know, they were regarded as people who were somehow in touch with the gods and were somehow kind of special in a sense. Whereas now, as this kind of process of formalization within society takes place, as regulatory institution begins to take hold, and there are more and more laws against being unemployed, you get more and more people locked up, and you get more and more people thrown into what would be mental asylums, but are actually incredibly should we say, vague in the criteria that you would have to end up getting locked up in a workhouse. You know, so they would try to put these people to work. Obviously, you had people who now would be deemed schizophrenic, totally incapable of functioning like that. But nonetheless, these became the emergent social deviants. With that particular process, you also have the persecution of women as witches, which you can make a strong argument is closely related to economics and the new requirements of women to be only producers of labor rather than to work the land. And basically, you can make a strong argument, as Silvia Federici does, and as I would agree, that basically women are seen more and more as simply the reproducers of labor themselves. But we can go into some of the suspicions around these types of characters in a moment. So, the next typology then is the emerging capitalist, because of course not everyone was caught up in these kind of violent cycles of persecution. Of course some people cottoned on to, particularly the landed gentry, cottoned on to the idea that they could really get something out of it, they should really start to take more control and have more and more power. And that happens with the emerging merchant class. The more trade is going on, the more value is being generated by these individuals, the more powerful they become. And the final typology then is, you know, what is produced by this whole process of disciplinary action? Well, it's kind of the modern, I would say this is the kind of where we are now, and I would say that there's a kind of a double metaphor here insofar as there was of course a lot of physical beheading going on, but one of the really sad things I think about this whole process, and really what I want to talk about for a short period now, is the way in which knowledge, as well as land, was enclosed, privatized, taken out of the public discussion, taken out of public usage, and therefore kind of brings people down into a much smaller imaginative space, you know, a much smaller scope, and therefore living in without as much kind of conceptual apparatus as they might have had when they were allowed or permitted to have more pagan ideas as well as the other religions side by side. Now it's really like the march of the church and the march of industry and the march of manufacturing. And so really what you find is that certain types of knowledge become deviant in themselves. So Silvia Federici makes an argument that essentially what happened to women during this period wasn't only that they were kind of rounded up, burnt at the stake, and kind of separated from their communal discourse, which was taking place in the fields where they were working, but also they were taken away from some of the basic medicines and knowledges which they had of the land. And I think what's kind of crucial here is that one of the essential practices which women would exchange, and they would share this kind of information during the sort of early medieval period, if you want to call it that, was autonomous forms of contraception. You know, so they would actually be able to regulate and decide with a great deal more accuracy and a great deal more agency when they were going to reproduce, when they were going to, you know, bring people into the world, and when they were going to actually go through this incredibly disruptive process. And so there are numerous documented examples of herbs and plants which women would tend to in their own gardens, which were then outlawed and demonized, literally, and you were burnt at the stake for developing these practices and for sharing this kind of knowledge and information. So from deviant through to discipline. This is basically a schema of the things that I've just elaborated upon. I wanted to kind of bring the market back in there because I think it's still important to say that the market was still a place of exchange during this period. Only women were prohibited from actually selling and having any engagement in commerce during this period as well. So markets, working on the land, and other communal festivals, such as like the May Day, for example, were all outlawed, and they were all places where women could exchange knowledge and information about the way in which, up until that point, they had been able to regulate their lives and keep society strong. I think one of the main kind of priorities of the emerging state during that period was to break up communities, break up the family system, and kind of make people dependent on the wage, so that they could basically become more dependent on labor and the other things that would come with that, because up until that point, you know, like the peasant workers were kind of turning up to do a bit of work for the feudal lord and then sort of like throwing a bit of muck in a barrow and then screw this and going home. I mean, they had to employ people to watch over them to make sure that they were really working enough. So the feudal process really goes through a crisis in the kind of in the sort of mid-medieval to late medieval period. And then all these other kind of disciplinary practices emerge as a way to kind of make this great transition through to manufacturing, and then it will become the early industrial revolution as well. So this is another one of the kind of graphics which I've put together, and you know, it's been a real pleasure to try and reinterpret the ideas back through a kind of visual lens, if you like, or through a different sort of conceptual lens. And then we arrive at this rather sad figure of the kind of the locked up masses. And again, there's a nice link here back with the Delander, because one of the things that really made me think, okay, this is going to make sense. Like, this is going to be a meaningful transition from one scale to another. Is that I started to see these kind of feedback loops that Manuel Delander was discussing in terms of thermodynamics, in terms of the way in which chemical processes take place within the Foucault itself. So Foucault documented the kind of cozy relationship between these houses of correction. So the houses of correction were these kind of facilities that became more and more prevalent, which were to basically lock up the mentally ill. Or, then there was the kind of worrying ambiguity here, those who wouldn't be able to work or those who were unwilling to work. So if you were found on the streets without a job during, say, like the 16th century, then you could be locked up for being a vagabond, for being unemployed. And what happened is that actually it wasn't really one group or another, despite their kind of apparently fairly clear mission statement. What you actually found is that you had this real heterogeneity of conditions and backgrounds and ages, and all kinds of different people swept up in this great change were locked up within these sort of institutions. And it's only really in the kind of 17th century, 18th century that you actually get what we would refer to as the mental institution itself. So you had this weird relationship between the House of Correction and the new sort of centers of manufacturing, these new kind of early factories, really. And what would happen is that the factory would set up, and then they would basically have a bunch of, they would have a kind of a limit on the amount of labor that they could absorb from the local environment. You would get a load of people that were unwilling or unable to work that would get thrown into the House of Correction. But then, of course, they would get you to work in the House of Correction anyway. So then these houses of correction, they started to undercut the prices of the factories, which of course closes down the factory, throws more people on the streets, and the houses of correction ended up completely rammed to the breaches and were completely unsustainable. And of course, this happened over and over again. If you look at, like, in Norwich and Bristol, for example, in the United Kingdom, you get this kind of historical characteristic, this historical pattern that emerges where the House of Correction and the manufacturing kind of just cancel each other out, and you end up back to square one, where people are basically either leaving, running away, or they end up in small-scale manufacturing processes themselves. So I wanted to kind of like illustrate that in a way that didn't try to sort of say, okay, well, for me, all the deviants are going to be in red, or like all the manufacturing work, all the agricultural workers are going to be in yellow, because it's really complex. It's a really complex kind of amalgam of typologies, and people are kind of flowing from one form of lifestyle to another. They're being kind of disciplined for one thing and then turning up somewhere else. And of course, at this period, you have so many of the religious wars raging within the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation that people are really thrown around Europe in a pretty kind of violent period, really. And it's interesting as well, if you look at the David Graeber again, he says that actually, all of this happened in, for example, China about 200 or 300 years earlier. It's just that in Western Europe, it's a particularly violent expression of this kind of process, this kind of enlightenment, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's called the Enlightenment, but in many ways, like I sort of say in the book, like the Age of Enlightenment is actually illuminated by the smouldering remains of countless female and male bodies on these kind of terrible pyres. So in the end then, what I think I would argue is that what we've ended up with is a kind of a world really where everything is for sale, everything is available, land is privatized, labor becomes, the waged sort of race to the bottom, especially now when we see with immaterial labor and the globalization of labor, you can get someone to do, whatever your web design in Bangalore for 30 cents an hour or something. And this comes, all together with this kind of mechanized era. So this is, of course, in one sense it's a clock, but in another sense it's also a cog, within the overall machinery of what will become the Industrial Revolution. So that's kind of my thesis, and I think what I would like to do now is open and see if there are any questions. The plants, again, within the book are a reference to this sort of deviant knowledge, this kind of criminalized knowledge that women were using as autonomous contraceptive. But of course, just by its very nature, there are an infinite number of ways of, sort of tracing and looking for deviance, of trying to find this kind of obscure, in-between, non-category, this kind of transitional aspect. And I think perhaps if I want to conclude with a sort of position that I've taken on the whole thing, is that I think really deviant knowledge itself isn't so much a body, a single thing. It's actually just about having to acknowledge that we have so many limits about what we can know and what we can understand, and the way in which we categorize things has got so many flaws, just by the sort of ever-evolving universe within which we live. So I guess what I'm interested then, more broadly in my practice, is kind of creating and exploring spaces for the deviant to exist, and within which deviant forms of knowledge can proliferate. So thank you. That wasn't too much.
Why is the bloke that you picked as an hunter-gatherer so sharp and jagged?
Right. I think I wanted to kind of create a sort of typology which trod kind of lightly upon the ground that it was attempting to discuss, So I think when I kind of came up with these figures, they were really emotive. I didn't feel like, you could say, oh, it's a bit sort of Keith Haring mixed with sociology or something. Actually, it was a really aesthetic decision. It was just that I wanted something which kind of worked for me visually. But I mean, they all had these pointy little legs. And when I gave this talk at Weissensee, my professor Andreas was sort of like, I think you've chosen the right type of form to walk kind of carefully across this material, because it's very easy to make generalizations, and you do have to be careful. Yeah. Pointy little characters. I mean, they're sharp, aren't they? So any other questions? Is no one going to talk about Brexit?
When you talk about the amount like people being organised in one way or another, how do you figure that with, let's say, quite obviously from medieval times to now, how many more people there are on the planet? Because it's a huge, it's frightening.
Yeah, sure.
So how do you figure that with the kind of discussion that you're putting forward in this book?
Well, I mean, I think this whole process of scaling up, I guess it comes with all kinds of different historical events like colonialization. And what that means is that you also have a narrowing and a formalization of language. And so once you start to have languages being spoken across continents, across a great many more people, then it allows these regulatory institutions to kind of feed their own practices into bigger and bigger volumes of persons. And what you have, for example, in kind of, I guess, the 17th century and late 16th, 17th century is the kind of mechanization of the military as well. And so this whole process by which, the length to which your gun is going to shoot, the time it takes to reload, how many people it takes to line up a kind of a squadron of soldiers to kill X amount of people, that all becomes internalized within which the sort of state military apparatus is operating. And that applies to, one of the kind of the Big Bang, historically one of the Big Bangs is kind of the plague. So the only way in which people managed to defeat the plague in the end was by systematizing it, by systematizing the symptoms, by systematizing the victims, and by systematizing the survivors. And that was, Foucault would argue, one of the big transitions into a more regulated society. Once that took place, it then fed into things like the military, to trade and markets. Trade and markets are really driving everything because it's how you eat. So the more efficient your market is, the better for everyone, and of course everyone becomes a big proponent of that. There's nothing inherently wrong with the market. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Trying to make something more efficient, I don't think. It's just that there's this kind of human narrative which gets left on the side. And that's one which I guess we see more and more as societies start to become less and less stable, but of course we're less and less prepared to deal with what it means to share, with what it means to have the discomfort of having to wait in line, whatever. It's something which we experience incredibly rarely in this part of the world, but which perhaps we will experience more within our lifetimes. So I think as populations boom, as that happens in conjunction with language, and it happens in conjunction with the capacity for legislation to boom along with that. And of course now we have a hyper-regulated society in terms of surveillance as well.
It's just that more and more people are surviving for a lot longer. And things, I just find the violence of the Middle Ages is reoccurring and reoccurring and reoccurring, and the violence hasn't gone, but more and more people seem to survive. And that's kind of weird. I find that weird.
Yeah, I haven't attempted to kind of bring my argumentation into a contemporary place yet, because I'm very aware that once something becomes absolute, it also starts to decay. So I don't want to sort of try and make any sort of master jumps, but I suppose what you could say, and I think what a lot of commentators have pointed to, is that the violence we experience now is just very different. It's kind of unthinkable for us to live off the grid. It's almost unthinkable for us to kind of not have, an address, for example, things that we take for granted. Whereas, in the early period that we're talking about, okay, it's taken 500 years, but you would just wander and find what you found. There was such a thing as the commons once, where you could actually, a lot of the land, certainly in the United Kingdom, all across Europe, all across the world, really, was there to be had. What the excess that the feudal lords couldn't use, you could eat. And that's a total anathema now, And so I think, so the violence isn't that we need to be beat with sticks anymore as regularly. And again, in this part of the world, very rarely, really. It's more that our imaginative space, like our political imagination, has been hugely decayed, I would say. And so you start to see these kind of like expressions of autonomous collectives, of people trying to do things outside of regulatory institutions, but actually they're not all that deviant. They're not as radical as they might think they are. There's a huge market for being cool and deviant, and being punk and wearing a little anarchist logo on your arm. Well, it's not deviant. It's not radical at all, So I think the places that one can find like a really radical kind of political environment are very thin, and they're very small, and I think they're very precious. And I don't claim to have found one. I went to live on this island in Bulgaria last year, go back there again sometime, but it's not a utopia. It's a very problematic place, and it's privately owned anyway, so, the history of violence, I think it's something you can get into, and you can get, I made some rules for myself when I was going through all this, and I was like reading the news a lot, and it's like one of them is not to try and create an absolute, and the other one is not to try and get too miserable, because it is an incredibly violent history.
Alex, as far as I know, you have been making interventions here in CTU, and I would like to know how your analytical proposal of the deviance can explain, for instance, the time bank you have been developing here in our Rotterdam.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I really skimmed over that because I didn't want to throw that many curveballs. But I think part of the reason in my analysis of the time bank is that we tried to bring together these two different value systems. So it's not that time banks are inherently flawed. Time banks are working all over. They're alive and well in Berlin. They're alive and well all over the world. But it was the kind of concern of the collective to try and make it into a kind of creative cultural platform at the same time. So the idea would be that the time bank would be a kind of like a data set. It would be a kind of like an activity. It would be a base, and it would be a social encounter with lots of different people around lots of different ideas. But parallel to that and concurrently with it, we would also be commenting on it. We would also be discussing kind of anarchic syndicalism, left liberal politics. And of course, like being me as well, I wanted to make radio shows, and I wanted to kind of like keep expressing a creative energy within that, which meant that there was this kind of like really fun tension, like we had like a lottery. We had kind of like Leah was doing this time bank where you could just sort of sit and waste your time, and it sort of somehow went back into the overall credits that you had within the time banking system. And it was all really playful, but the problem was, in the end, that I didn't personally feel comfortable with like getting people involved in a sort of clean, practicing, like functional time bank, and also using them to create kind of cultural capital, which is what we all do as artists and cultural producers of lots of different types, and then not be a real functioning time bank. And the problem was for me was that like after 6 months of doing all the PR and selling all the lottery tickets, and like we did like a live lottery on the radio with like winners and stuff, and it was all like incredibly kind of like well organized from a PR perspective. But when it came to actually systematizing it and getting all those matches to connect with each other, it was just like, oh my god. It was like having a baby, for want of a better expression, because it was such a big job. It's like it's a full-time job, and of course we hadn't really materially gotten to a position where we could pay ourselves out of it, other than in time credits, which was very beautiful, but not going to pay the rent. And so it just kind of, in my opinion, sort of collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Not without being a really valuable thing to have done, and not without having been a meaningful discussion. And I thought like some good work, as it were. But yeah, so that was complicated. But I thought it was interesting as well, because it kind of made me, I think, take a position on the relationship of the arts and the kind of like social practitioner, and like what does that even all mean? I mean, it's been going on for 30 years now, since Stephen Willits, for example, but also the art placement group, and they've been working with like companies and organizations for years and years and years, and doing great work, and sort of getting aesthetic concern out to different audiences, translating ideas into different visual languages, which I'm still really interested in doing. But at the same time, that practice has been adopted by so many corporate groups to kind of like reputation launder their image, that it's sort of like the bomb started to feel like it had fallen out that bit, and then I just wondered if there was really any difference between me and us promoting our own practices, and then kind of, but also saying we have a social agenda, and like the social agenda was kind of suffering, not as a result, but suffering too much, I thought, to be ethical to keep doing it. So my final conclusion was that basically we were bankrupt because we had inflation. Because like basically more and more people wanted to get involved in the time bank, and we had less and less energy to put into it, and that's inflation, right? It's like demand outstripping supply. So we crashed. Yeah. But it's tricky. I mean, the great thing about the ZKU is that it is a free space, but that comes with a huge amount of like ambiguity about how you're going to get things done, and like the structural stuff that other institutions have, we don't have, but then we also have a lot of room to maneuver. And I actually think that ultimately it's a good model, and I think that model that I mentioned in my introduction about like never becoming, never being final, never allowing yourself to kind of like become a single entity is valuable. It's just that it's also quite poetic, and I don't know that that's always acknowledged within the ZKU themselves. Yeah. So, if there are any more questions?
To the title, the trouble that comes in the title, is that the enlightenment or the deviant persons? Or I was wondering.
Yeah, that's so completely bang on. And it's crazy that you asked that, because actually, I mean, like Anna said in her introduction, this idea of staying with the trouble from I always manage to forget her name. Donna Haraway, who I've read and really admire the work of. So Donna Haraway would say, like, you know, staying with the trouble is like staying with the physics, like staying with the problems, like not trying to ignore the problem of knowledge production or of whatever political situation that you're in. I think for me, Here Comes Trouble was very much kind of like an acknowledgement that this wasn't going to be a kind of straightforward run through a body of research and I was going to be able to get from one side to the end. As things developed and like Trump is in the news and then everything is going on with Brexit, it started to become like weirdly convenient to have Here Comes Trouble. Like I was in the bookstores day before yesterday, sort of like, haha, isn't it funny that, you know, we've got this referendum next week, it's a coincidence, but isn't it funny? But I don't think that we are in this position where it's kind of the brink of an apocalyptic era. You know, I don't want Here Comes Trouble to be sensationalist. You know, I think it's more that we've yet to get to the point where people are really being ascribed this label of social deviancy and being kind of rounded up, and it's getting like problematic in the way that, you know, all kinds of other processes of social organization have become incredibly violent in, you know, not too far away history. So Here Comes Trouble then, I suppose, was about, in the sense, like in one sense, locating it in the here and now, but in, I think, a more important sense for me was more about making it into a spatial argument and saying that, like, Here Comes Trouble is about sort of seeing something coming. It's about kind of like looking and being like, oh, here comes trouble, like that doesn't fit in. That doesn't quite fit into my mathematical analysis. That doesn't quite work with like my social expectations. So it's all about like recognizing it, and it's kind of having this sort of like spatial relationship to the norm, you know, this thing that it's coming toward or going away from. Yeah. It also turned out to be a really challenging period of my life as well, so it fitted in.
Say again?
It also turned out to be like a really challenging personal period in my life, so the whole time I was sort of like, okay, fine, there it is.
Yeah, I get it. It's a little bit personal also, yeah?
Somehow, yeah, somehow. There is the, yeah, I mean, I definitely like arguing on the side of deviance, on the side of deviancy. Yeah, it comes with its own problems.
So is Britain going to stay in the European Union? Or?
I don't know. What do you think, Dad?
I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah, possibly it will. Possibly it will, yeah. I mean, I think...
A little trouble might be good, maybe. You know? I don't know.
Certainly there's a lot of trouble at the moment, and I think that, you know, there's definitely some pretty dark elements that come to the surface in Britain at the moment. I think that if there is anything to be kind of learned from the two different cases to do with the study, you know, the study of witches and the study of the mentally disabled, is to say that, like, you know, the more fear you have, and the least, and the sort of, if you're poorly educated, scared people make mistakes, you know. And so one thing perhaps we can do is to stay educated and not let ourselves become scared, because that's, I think, when other people get control of your political imagination. And I think that's exactly what the whole Brexit campaign is riding on. I mean, you see this poster that they came out with last week, and it's this kind of, the hordes approaching, but Britain has taken like less people than anywhere else in Europe, so what exactly, who, you know, it's so sort of transparent in a sense, but troublingly persuasive for a lot of people as well. Certainly in a sensationalist kind of public way, but you just never know how people are going to go when it comes to the day, I don't think. I mean, it's like thugs and hooligans and psychopaths. I mean, the murder of Joe Cox is just like, it's got to be the expression of the most sort of terrifying miscalculation between the real, like really what's going on and who's to like blame. I mean, you know, the government goes through an austerity package, cuts social welfare, cuts welfare for the disabled, makes it illegal to have a spare room in your house without having some complete stranger live in it. Of course you're going to get people who are upset and angry, and they need a way of venting that. And then within all of that, you get someone who's just like internalizing all this fucking stuff, turns out to be a neo-Nazi, possibly neo-Nazi sympathizer anyhow, and then he does something like that. It's like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. If you keep telling people they're at breaking point, they're going to break eventually. But I don't think we're there yet, and I hope we don't get there. But in a sense, my arguments don't really relate to that particular kind of nightmare scenario where deviancy is really The ambiguity with which deviancy can be used is very, very scary. So we should keep the term deviancy ambiguous. By paradoxical turn, actually, what's good is to keep the idea of deviancy fluid, so it doesn't become one thing. Once it becomes one thing, like witches or mentally disabled, then you're really kind of getting into some scary ideological thinking, I think. Yeah.
So you think that the Brexit camp are the deviants in this case?
I think, in a sense, for Britain to leave the European Union is an expression of kind of deviant behaviour, in a sense, yeah. Deviancy doesn't have a right and a wrong. It doesn't come, in my opinion, in my idea of it, doesn't come with a moral qualifier. Actually, I don't really think, because that was what you were saying, like, is trouble enlightenment? That's the thing, is that, during this period I've also been reading this kind of like esoteric, like Bible studies book, basically, and as far as like this kind of like ultimate, kind of very high-flying, sort of theoretical, like theological conceptualization goes, to become enlightened is actually to acknowledge the violence of the universe. It's not to suddenly become like at one with everything. It kind of is, but it's also to acknowledge that everything also has a very dark side to it. And so, deviancy just sort of cuts about within all of this stuff, but it's all kind of fairly morally relative for like thermodynamics and stuff. I mean, molecules don't have a right and a wrong; they just do their thing. And unfortunately, I suspect that history will be like that in the long run as well. We do make mistakes. Incredibly depressing note to end on. Like I say, you have to have the agency to not make the mistakes. The whole point is to stay educated and not have the fear of like the darkness. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you.